Welcome to Biz Help for You with host Candy Messer. Entrepreneurs like to focus on the big picture, like profitability, success, and a smooth running organization. But there always seems to be those little things like taxes, employee compensation, laws, regulations, and more. Now you can get the answers you need in one place. Join us today as we break it all down for you. Now, here's your host, Candy Messer.
Hello and welcome to Biz Help for You with Candy Messer. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found the information on last week's show, the difference between management and leadership and why it matters, informative. If you're unable to join us and would like to listen to the show, links can be found on our YouTube and Facebook pages, as well as multiple favorite podcast platforms. If you'd like to receive notifications when our episodes have been uploaded, please like and subscribe. If there are topics you'd find beneficial or questions you have, please feel free to reach out to me at media@abnp.com. Now let's learn a little bit about our guest today. Marvin L Storm has founded, acquired, and scaled businesses in the equipment, leasing, business services, tech, and franchise sectors over the past 4 decades. After exiting his last business, he planned to enjoy life, but after a brief stint in the slow lane, he realized that sitting on the sidelines wasn't his style. After considering his options, he felt that leveraging his decades of startup, operational, and C-suite experience could help entrepreneurs scale, create, and then execute profitable business exit strategies. With this idea in mind, he launched the Business Exit Stories podcast, where he interviews M&A advisors, investment bankers, business brokers, and other transaction professionals, inviting them to share their war stories of their good, bad, and ugly deals for the benefit of entrepreneurs who are in the early stages of thinking about and positioning their businesses for an eventual exit. He's also developed strategies entrepreneurs need to be able to double the money they put into their pocket when they sell their business. Marv has and continues to serve on numerous company boards of directors, consults with entrepreneurs on their exit strategies, provides expertise witness testimony in litigation and arbitration cases, and is a frequent speaker, exit coach, author, and podcaster. So Marvin, welcome to my episode.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you too. This is a great topic. I know there's a lot of people who are thinking someday they're going to, sell their business, and they're thinking, well, it's way in the future and I don't need to think about it now. So I know it's going to be great information for them to let them know what they should be doing. But before we get into kind of the topic of today, I would love for you to share a little bit more information about how you even got into doing this.
Well, I'd like to share that actually, because it's kind of relevant and of, kind of what I'm doing today. I grew up in an entrepreneurial family and watched my father, the peaks and valleys and getting off into the weeds of running your own business. And I went through that process. So I guess it's kind of my entrepreneurial DNA is always lurked between the surface there. But, I went and got a degree, and it happened to be in accounting, and I went to work for a national accounting firm, Deloitte, what it is known today.
Right.
And, I was playing pickup basketball and with a bunch of guys every Tuesday night for a couple of hours. And as things go when you're playing basketball and after you're showering and getting ready to go home for the day, we got to chatting, and I became really good friends with one of the guys there. And before you know it, we're talking about business and what our dreams and aspirations were and the frustrations of what we're doing currently, and being an employee in a large organization, and just that dream of sailing your own ship. And before you know it, we'd turn in our resignations and rented a small office in a downtown high rise and got a couple of desks and 2 phones and put the desks facing each other, and we were in business. And, so that's how I sort of left, the corporate environment and, sort of struck out on my own. And we sort of hit it, being in the right place at the right time really helped and facilitated, the growth of what we were doing. The business grew. I've often likened this to being on a surfer. When the wave comes, you don't do a lot to generate the wave, but if you have a surfboard and you're smart enough to get up on the surfboard, you can have a great ride. And that's kind of what happened to us. But, our personal objectives changed. We did this for almost 10 years and grew from, that small office to renting nearly 2 floors of a downtown office building and had, dozens of people working for us. But the stress of everything and our life objectives change. I kind of wanted to go one direction. My partner kind of wanted to go in another, and we were great friends, and we just agreed that it was probably time. And so
Mhm.
we did. We agreed to step away and exit the business, and so that was my first experience of going through the emotional, I guess, turmoil of deciding
Mhm.
that where one partner decides, this rodeo is good and I'm having a great time on this horse, and the other partner got bucked off or, sore and he doesn't want to be in the saddle anymore. And
Mhm.
so, it's those type of things that you don't anticipate. You don't go to school, you don't learn. You kind of have to go through it or know someone that's gone through it to understand, how big of an impact that can have on your future plans. But entrepreneurs are resilient, and I kind of just stood back, did my kind of homework, and got reflective, and then got involved in another business and scaled that, and
Mm.
a chain of events led to that an exit from that business into another one. And finally, I had the opportunity not to really start a business from scratch, but to acquire one.
Mm.
And I was sitting on the board of directors on one of these companies and was asked if I would be interested in acquiring the company. And so I did. I brought in private equity and acquired the company. And that was an entirely new experience. And now it wasn't me as an entrepreneur making all the decisions because I was the founder, the decision maker. Uh, I was actually working for the company. I was the CEO. I answered to a board of directors that included, outside board of directors, the private equity people. And that was something I had to get used to, of
Mhm.
being able to get approvals, submit budgets, meet objectives, explain if you didn't, why, uh, and have a plan of where you're going from there. And so, one of the things I really didn't understand about that environment that I hadn't been in before was that when you take outside capital, although I understood this intellectually,
Mhm.
that private equity and any investor that commits money to a company, they have their own goals and objectives,
Mhm.
and they want a
Right.
return on that money.
Mhm.
And it isn't about the entrepreneur, wanting to build something and leave a legacy and build something to pass on to your employees or your family or someone like that. They want a monetization event. And
Right.
depending on the holding period, it could be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, but they have a clock. And when I took that money, intellectually understood it, but the reality of when that time arrived, and I was told in a board of directors meeting, we need to start moving toward a monetization event to
Mhm.
sell the business. I just was not emotionally prepared because I saw this grand vision of where I wanted to go, and there was still a lot to do. And but I didn't have I had to answer the board, and I didn't control
Mhm.
the board. And so what happened is that worked on positioning the company for an exit and had a relatively good exit, but it was my first rodeo
Mhm.
at this level. And if I had been, when after I had stepped away and, I actually took some time off to be reflective and kind of, you had mentioned the slow lane.
Mhm.
You spend so many years and decades in that fast lane. You have the pedal to the metal. You're going full out. You're working long hours. It's exciting. You're doing new things. And that's energizing for an entrepreneur. And that's kind of the environment I was in. I was creative. I spun out divisions and launched new concepts within the company and added value, enterprise value to the organization, significant value. And it was time now for me to do and what I promised to do, and that was give the investors a good return. But when I
Mhm.
stepped back and now I was in the slow lane and in some cases just parked on the side of the road, that was kind of boring. and just wasn't my cup of tea. And I just got to thinking about all these years that I've spent in business doing different things, what I've learned along the way, and especially when it comes to exit, because so often founders, business owners, entrepreneurs, they spend decades and sometimes a lifetime creating something, building something, and then become really good at it. They become kind of subject matter experts, and they just have that intuitive feel for their business, the market, competition. But when it comes to exiting their business, they don't do that every day like they do what they do to make money.
Mhm.
And so it's a new world. They haven't been through it before. And sometimes you take wrong turns and you make mistakes. You don't understand the rules of engagement. And that was every entrepreneur goes through that. And the problem,
Mhm.
I believe, is that entrepreneurs think that they operate in this mode of what makes them entrepreneurs, is that they like to solve problems and they enjoy the process of figuring out what the issue is, coming up with a creative solution, executing that solution, seeing it work. They get a real charge. And if it doesn't work, they reload and they do it again until they figure it out. And they think that that state of mind, that vision of what they do, and when it comes to exiting, they're going to be able to do the same thing. They're just going to
Mhm.
figure it out. The problem is you only get one shot. You only get to stand at the plate once and swing at the ball. And if you miss it, you strike out.
Right.
And so I got to thinking about all this and said, if I can offer some insight and help for entrepreneurs that are at that stage that are just starting to think about exiting, and I can offer them some insights and tools and processes, things that they need to do to optimize the value of their business. That would be kind of enjoyable, and I can kind of give
Right.
back. So that's what I decided to do. And instead of, interviewing the actual entrepreneurs, I love podcasting. So I thought I'll just do a podcast. I'll figure that
Mhm.
out and do the podcast. Instead of interviewing the people that had actually exited the business, I decided to interview the deal makers, the people that actually work with entrepreneurs and to help them optimize the value of their business. And I'll let
Mhm.
them bring their war stories. I'll let them bring the good deals, the bad deals, the deals that
Mhm.
blew up and didn't close, and some of the takeaways why those things happened. And it's just been a great ride. And so that's when I started the Business Exit Stories podcast. And this has hundreds of stories on it, real transactions of real people that had home runs and doubles and singles and a few strikeouts, and some of the sad stories when someone really drops the ball on that last
Mhm.
lap. It's really sad.
Mhm. Well, that's why I love having my podcast too, is because I want to have people on that can share their expertise so people can learn, from what they're hearing as well, instead of having gone through it and then looking in the rearview mirror saying, I wish I would have known, what I know now back then. So that's, my goal too, is just to help educate those business owners. And I know this is going to be informative and helpful for them who are thinking of planning, an exit in the future. So
Mhm.
thank you so much. I did want to say though, too, I know as entrepreneurs, we're often so busy just running our businesses or thinking like what we have to do to grow the business that we're not thinking, for that exit strategy and think, oh, well, it will happen when it happens. Or when I get a couple years out, I'll think about it. So what would you tell someone who knows that at some point in the future, they want to be out, selling it, whatever they're going to end up doing, but they're just busy running their company right now?
Well, that's one of the, when I speak in front of groups or masterminds or something like that, I get the question, the most frequently asked question I get, especially for those that are earlier in their scaling process, growing and
Mhm.
building, and even some that have just launched their business. Why in the heck would I want to think about selling my business? I'm so overwhelmed and buried right now. I don't have time to think about
Mhm.
selling the business. I'll worry about that 10 years from now. And I get it. I understand it. Uh, I've been in that chair. I know what it is to be overwhelmed and working long hours, 7 days a
Mhm.
week, and not taking
Right.
vacations. And I've been down that road, so I get it. However, I'll say with a caveat that it isn't necessarily about the time that you would spend positioning or thinking about a future event that you're going to sell. It's more about a philosophy or an attitude and a thought process. And I can share dozens of examples, and I'll just share one here. A story that's told on my podcast by an M&A advisor sharing details of a transaction that just about went sideways and ruined a guy's entire 25 years of building an iconic business. And it all dealt with one thought process when it was completely not considered how that decision would impact the sale years down the road. And that this particular business was in the retail sector, and they had a location. The business had, over a period of years, built a phenomenal reputation, a lot of goodwill. They were located in a historical part of the city. The building they were located in, the little center they were located in, was known for hundreds of miles around. It was kind of like the Pioneer Center. It was a building that had heritage to it, and the products they sold were not only for local residents, but for tourists that visited the area. They always seemed to make their way to this business, and so their customer acquisition cost was low. Great margins. Business continued to grow. It had one of the highest per square foot, retail sales per square foot of that type of industry in the whole country. Phenomenal business. And the landlord to this building was a personal friend of the founder of this business, and they had executed every 5 years for 25 and going on 30 years a lease. And the guy said he didn't even remember what the terms of the lease were. He signed that 25 years ago, and every 5 years they renewed it, and there was a little bump in the rent, but it was kind of the good buddy discount on rent, and there was never any problems with the lease. And so he was thinking about selling in 3 or 4 years, and the lease came up for renewal, and just like they'd done all the time, without thinking what the impact that lease would have on the sale of the building, he executed the lease. And when the time came to sell, and he got this phenomenal offer for the business because it was a great business, and it had good management, it had all the check boxes that you go down. When the attorney on the other side reviewed the lease and says, well, it looks like this lease isn't assignable. We have to execute a new lease. Even thought about it, says, no problem. I know the landlord, I'm sure he'll sign a new lease. But when there's money on the table, significant amount of money on the table, friends are friends until there's money involved.
Right.
And so when the lease came up for renewal, he had, I'm going to use some numbers here that aren't really relevant, but to give you an idea, let's say it was a $50,000 lease payment on an annualized basis. And that $50,000 was very reasonable and manageable and contributed to the profitability of the business. And because the business was such a good business, it was going to sell for 5 times the net profits and the EBITDA for the company. 5 times, which was high for that sector, but it was a great business. And so the $50,000, and I'm just going to say it was $200,000 profit. You multiply that by time, it was worth much more than that. But for illustration purposes, I'll say it was $1 million. 5 times 200,000, $1 million, and that's what he was going to walk away from, with money in his pocket, and it was going to be a cash sale. And when the lease came back, the new lease came back, it wasn't for $50,000 or $55,000 or maybe even $60,000. It was for $150,000.
Oh, wow.
The rent, which was it was high for the market, but it was aggressive. And that just sent the temperature, blood pressure went up, and heated negotiations ensued. Now, just think about the impact of that. So you've added another reduction of $100,000 of expenses increased expenses. So your profitability went from $200,000 down to $100,000. So that extra $100,000 of rent payments multiplied by 5, that's $500,000 of decreased value in that business. And so it wouldn't have taken a lot of time, and I'm quite sure, and the advisor said he was quite sure that, executing and talking about the lease 5 years in advance when it wasn't in the middle of a deal where there was a lot of leverage, that probably would have been negotiated, or something would have been negotiated. It would have been very reasonable. It wouldn't have been a big deal because they had a relationship. But when you're down to the point of closing the sale, and the person on the other side of the table has leverage, the landlord has leverage, bad things can happen. So that's one of the types of things. It wasn't necessarily going to spend a lot of time thinking of working on the exit for that, but it was the thought process that, well, these are agreements that I'm executing that could have an impact when I'm selling. Same thing with employment contracts and vendor contracts and things of that nature. It's thinking about how those agreements that you're going to sign are going to impact the eventual exit. And so that's just one example of why should I think about selling my business now when I'm so busy running it? Well, you need to get into the state of mind that someday you're going to sell it, and how are decisions I'm making today going to impact that? It can have a huge impact. And in the real life example that we just talked about here, it had a substantial, devastating impact on the valuation of that business.
Right. There's so many things to think about. Like I said, I mean, there's vendor relations and customer relations and, product pricing and all these different things that probably go into that. But can you talk about the 3 things that every entrepreneur should do to make sure that their business is actually positioned for a successful exit?
Well, there's a whole list of things, but if I had to come up with 3, I would say, and not in any specific order of importance here, but I would go back to my last comment here, and that you really need to think about that it is going to happen. Something is going to happen that is going to require you to step away from your business, unless you plan on living forever, which isn't too likely. So you're either going to sell the business to a family member, pass it on. You're going to sell it to an employee, transfer it to your partner. There's going to be some event that is going to have the control of the business, leave your side of the table and go to somebody else. And that's someone you know, or it's going to be someone you don't know, and that's a third party. And the rules of engagement and how you think about that are entirely different. So I think one of the things you really need to start thinking about is who the buyer is going to be. Who do you think the buyer might be? And so if you're a business that you are the business and you have to show up every day for things to happen, if that's the type of buyer that you think you're going to be selling to, well, that's a very small bucket of buyers. There's a very small universe of people that are going to be able to step into who you are and have the level of expertise and do what you do. And so if that's who you're going to sell to, then you have to think differently about how you're going to find that person and start looking for that person a long time in advance. Or if you've managed to think about that, you actually have good people working for you and you don't have to show up every day, then there's a different type of buyer, and that bucket is much bigger. And there's a lot more people in that bucket that would come in and let the people run the business, and they'll focus on growing the business and managing the business and improving on new products and services and marketing and sales and those type of things. That's what they want to do, and that's a bigger bucket. And then if you've managed to create some real scale to your business and you have a unique product or service that is creating some really great margins, you may move into the world of the third bucket, and that are the private equity world, people that will purchase your business and bring additional capital to the business to give it fuel to grow it to even bigger. And that's how they're going to get their return on their money. And that's even a bigger bucket, especially today. If you have a great business, there are private equity companies out there by the hundreds that are looking for good businesses, and they have cash and they will pay good money for a great business. So if that's kind of who you are, and then you kind of have the strategic bucket, are people that look at your business because of what you do and they don't do what you do, but they have a bunch of customers that could use what you do. And they will throw valuation metrics, traditional valuation metrics from a financial perspective out the window, because that's important to them and they can get a very quick return on their investment. I have tons of stories on the podcast that about how people have gotten 2, 5, 10 times the value of what they thought the financially metrics would demand and value the business at. They got 10 times that amount because of the strategic positioning and who the advisor was able to bring to the table. Yeah, I could share stories, and I'll just share a very brief one because it's such a great story. There was a company that was in manufacturing and the tool and die, and they manufactured a specific type of component for the aerospace industry. And they were kind of unique in what they do, and they had a very profitable business. And they were getting ready to sell the business, and they had some inbound traffic of people that were interested in buying the business. Entrepreneurs know that have a good business, you get calls all the time from people saying they want to buy your business. And I had those, and most of the time I said, no, I'm not interested, and wish I wasn't at the time. But this person was getting to the point, he'd been doing this for 25, 30 years, and he was thinking now about selling. And so he took these inbound calls and started negotiation. You know, he's an entrepreneur, he's negotiated a lot of deals, and he started the negotiations, and they were just getting pretty close to closing. And COVID hit. And of course, everyone stands back when COVID hit and said, we got to wait and see what happens here. But the buyer went away for a period of time, but the seller was really teed up. He really wanted to sell now. And so he went out and now engaged an actual professional, an M&A advisor, to help him. And the M&A advisor looked at the deal that he had negotiated and everything and said, you know, there's a lot more value here. I think we should reposition the business. So if you'll work with me for, 3, 4, 5 months and kind of repackage the business for sale, we'll go back out into the market and see what we can do. And so that's what they did. And they went back out into the market. The M&A advisor went to other people that were strategically aligned, went back to the same buyer that had solicited and made an inbound call months earlier. And I'm just going to use the example of X. They offered X for the business, which was a good price, fair price for the business. But the M&A advisor brought several other people to the table, also in the same niche, were competitors. And so we had competitors looking at the same acquisition here. And so the bidding started. It was kind of a blind auction where you don't tell them, what the price is. You say, this is the business, you make us an offer. And the offer started to come back in. And once the original buyer found out who else was at the table, they did not want their competitors to have this particular company and the expertise and the components that they had, because they knew that would put them at a competitive disadvantage. And and for this particular niche, it would take them years to develop their own and to overcome that strategic lead of adding this company to the mix. And so they threw the traditional valuation metrics out the window, which was how they made the offer the first time. And they offered 3 times as much over their original offer, just to block a competitor from getting the business. And same buyer, few months later, having someone on your team that knows what they're doing and can bring other people to the table created all of this value. And that meant tens of millions of dollars in this particular situation going into the bank account versus the original deal that he thought he was smart and going to save the fees and not have an advisor on his team. Sometimes you get penny wise and pound foolish.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there's so many times where people will do that. They want to save a little bit of money and it ends up costing them a lot more in the long run. So it's a good, thing for them to think about. But I did, while you were talking too and saying, think of who your buyer is going to be. A lot of people might think like, oh, I've got young kids. They're going to grow up. They're going to work in the business and then I'm going to leave it to them. They're going to take it over. And often that's not what the kids want to do. They want to do something else. So then what happens if they were planning for that and now that kind of plan is not really going to work? How do they make that shift to really be able to market it to someone outside of their company or their family?
Well, that's a great question. And generational type of businesses now are relatively rare.
Mhm.
There are some strong 2, 3, 4 generations. On the podcast, the oldest multi-generation was the 6th generation, where the wheels came
Mm,
off of the bus. The 6th generation did not want to be involved in the business after, and it was so heartbreaking for that 5th
mhm,
generation when they had very competent kids that had all gotten educations, had great jobs, had never really been involved in the business, didn't like the business, wanted nothing to do with it. And
mhm,
they always thought that the one person that worked in the business, the one individual that worked in the business would be able to take it over. But it was very obvious because of the scale of the business that that person really didn't have the abilities to take it over.
mhm,
And he was a great kind of general manager type, but he was not the entrepreneur, the risk taker, the creative genius, the ability that had all the HR and management skills. He was just a good operations person.
mhm,
And so they tried various ways to kind of make that work and eventually came to the conclusion that it just wasn't going to work. Fortunately for them, this thought process took place years in advance,
mhm,
as they tried to give this person more experience and, kind of broaden his management capabilities. He just wasn't interested and finally just said, hey, look, I know what you're trying to do. I'm not interested. I like my
mhm,
8 to 5 job. I like my lifestyle. I'm not interested in running the company. And so they had to shift gears and they had time to be able to do that. And there are stories on the podcast where that is kind of the plan, but life gets in the way and the
mhm,
founder has an unfortunate diagnosis medically
mhm,
that creates issues that greatly compress that time frame, and they have no alternative at that time, and the family is not ready. And then bad things can happen on that. So it comes back to this, you know, not the amount of time that you spend, but it's the thought process of getting pointed in the right direction so you know where you're going. And if family is an option, then there are a lot of companies out there that work with family, privately held businesses for succession planning, and they're very good at doing that. And I can refer people to them if that succession planning is what they want to do. There are companies that facilitate that process and are very good at it.
mhm. So I know you talked before about one of the mistakes was, having that contract that was, could have been negotiated long before. And that caused, a huge issue in what they were able to get for their business. But what are maybe some of the other mistakes that business owners need to be aware of if they're thinking of selling their business, whether in the very near future or distant future?
Well, one of the things, if depending on the type of buyer that you find, they're going to be interested in what type of revenue that you have. And a
Mhm,
mistake that a lot of entrepreneurs don't think through is different buyers have different perspectives on revenue. And really,
mm,
the type of revenue that you have really determines what the multiple is going to be a lot of times. And entrepreneurs just sometimes just don't think through that and what the impact the type of revenue you have is going to have on the valuation of your business. And I'll give you an
mhm,
example, an easy one to understand. A moving and storage company, for example, deals with a customer when they're getting ready to move and they get an inbound call, either because they found them on the internet and, however the moving and storage company solicits customers. but it's really a point of purchase type of decision. You aren't going to use a moving company until you're going to move.
Right.
And so when that happens, then they contact a bunch of moving and storage companies, and estimates are given, and you sign an agreement, and the movers come and move you, and they may be moving from, California to Indiana, and they're not coming back to California again. So that customer is never coming back. It's not a repeat customer.
Mhm.
Or I'll use the example of a company that has kind of one-off type of customers, or did have one-off type of customers, and that's heating and air conditioning type of companies. When it gets hot, you get a lot of calls because the air conditioning isn't working. And so there's a flood of calls. And a lot of the times you just have to go into line because they only have so many techs, and everyone's air conditioner isn't working when the first heat wave hits, or
Right.
when it gets cold, then the heater isn't working if you live in
Mhm.
cold climates. And so it's this roller coaster of revenue. And so, you know, really smart people in that industry say, okay, what I need to do is I have these customers that are good customers. We actually installed the system for them. They have it maintained. What we're going to do is create a maintenance agreement and management agreement for their system. And we're going to charge them an annual fee, and they will pay that fee. And we'll come out 2 or 3 times a year to do a tune-up for the the cooling season with the air conditioner, and also for the heater. And then we'll come out for a general inspection, do a complete inspection, during our downtime. We'll
Right.
do the deep dive into the functionality of their system. We're going to charge an annual contract. And then if something goes wrong, it's our premier customers that get
Mhm.
service first. They're
Mhm.
first in line. And so they altered the type of revenue from a one-off people calling in to 70–80% of their revenue was reoccurring, repeatable revenue. And they still had those one-off revenues, which they always converted over to a contract revenue. And so when people did call in, they would tell them, unfortunately, we can't service you for 2 weeks, but I tell you what you could do for the next time is sign one of our maintenance agreements, and we promise you within 12-hour time frame we'll be there.
Mhm.
And they gear up for that because they can figure out how many calls they're going to get, with an existing customer base that is somewhat predictable. And you can
Right.
do the analytics on how many calls you're going to get from your customer base and staff accordingly. And so when it comes time to sell, then that company that has just the repeatable, renewable, 70–80% of the revenue is there, and 20–30% is one-off type of customers that are going to convert anyway. A majority of them is valued entirely different than the company that doesn't have that type of revenue at all.
Right.
You're talking the difference between 2 or 3 times revenue to 7, 8, 9 times revenue. And that is like printing money. The difference between the same type of companies with the same volume, but different profile of revenue, you're talking the difference of millions of dollars, depending on the size of the business, just created out of thin air because you strategically thought about how to create this renewable, repeatable revenue that has less risk. It's very predictable.
Mhm.
And when a buyer comes to the table, it's all about risk. If they
Right.
perceive that, buying your business has accompanying risk, then the value is going to go down or the terms are going to go up. If they
Mhm.
see it less risk, then the price goes up and the terms go down. And it's just kind of economics and common sense. But a lot of people
Right.
don't think through that thing. And so the last thing I would say, which you probably would totally understand, is if absolutely 100%, 110% that the guy on the other side of the table who's going to be buying your business, regardless of the type of buyer that it is, one of these 4 buckets that we talked about, they're going to ask to see your financial statements. That's a
Right.
given. And yet, not enough attention is paid to assembling, historical very detailed with supporting documentation, financial statements that are bulletproof. There is no questions. All the information is disclosed. There are no shenanigans of reducing income. So often entrepreneurs who are really geared from the time they started their business are always looking, and their accountants are looking for ways to reduce that income of the business so they don't have to pay taxes. If they carry that over to the time they're exiting their business, they've just lost 50, 75% of the value of their business because they've been focused on reducing income instead of, structuring the tax payments appropriately to optimize tax, but not to eliminate income.
That's so true. And I think too, what I've heard as well for the valuation is not, of course, just the revenue that you have and, having the financial statements, which I agree, like we talked about earlier, so many people don't necessarily want to pay a professional. They think, oh, I could save money and I'll do it this way. So that's obviously a negative because your financials may not be the way that they need to be. But I've also heard that valuation can also take into consideration like the employees that you're retaining, your systems that you have in place. Like there's a lot of other things besides just the revenue or the profit that makes up that valuation. So can you touch on that just a little bit as well?
Yeah, we could spend all day talking about this. I said there's a whole list of things we could talk about, and those are the type of things that are less tangible. Okay. Revenue is a very tangible thing. Deciding who your buyer might be is really tangible, but the time window is really tangible. Your financial statements are real tangible. And those are givens that that the buyer is going to look at, but they're also going to look at all the things that you kind of mentioned there. What type of employees do you have? Are they long-term? What's your turnover? Are they happy? What's your benefit program? How well are they paid? Are they committed? Do they have employment contracts? What's the culture of the company, basically? A company with a strong identifiable culture, and a buyer will talk to the employees, and they will talk to the vendors, and they will talk to customers, and they will begin to put together this picture of what the culture of the company is all about. Or even if the company has even thought about a culture, they may have a culture that just evolves organically, not likely, but it does happen where the culture kind of just evolves. And it's really not, the entrepreneur really doesn't think about it. But for those who, again, are in this thought process of it, someday I'm going to sell my business, they're going to want to see, what my employees think about me, the company, their customers.
Right.
And that is really quantified in culture. And there are studies out there that show companies with strong culture. And there's a metric out there called the Net Promoter Score, where you often are probably asked, what are, on a scale of 1 to 10, or how are likely you to refer, someone to the company?
Right.
And that's kind of the Net Promoter Score question. And if you rate it a 10 or you rate it a 4, and so there's a formula that comes up, and those companies with a high Net Promoter Score are valued much greater, sometimes 30, 40, 50% more than companies without that Net Promoter Score. And it comes into valuation is not all about money. It's about the terms that are associated with the price and if you're going to get that money or not. If you have a really strong Net Promoter Score and you have really strong financial statements and your employees are happy and you have low turnover and you have a great culture, what that means is there's probably going to be more than one buyer at the table for your business. So the dynamics change. If you only have one buyer and that buyer knows he's the only buyer, he approaches the sale in a very aggressive negotiation position. However, as we've talked about before, if you have several buyers to the table, and if you're fortunate enough to get strategic buyers to the table that are all in the same industry, that are looking at your company as a strategic option, that's when culture, that's when your employees, that's when these intangibles that you talked about, how your customers feel about you, how loyal, what's the turnover, what's the customer acquisition cost. Those things then drive value because the terms sometimes become non-existent. It becomes a cash deal. because
Right.
people are just willing to put down the money to grab your company before somebody else does. And so it's those intangibles that will really enhance the value of your business beyond what the financial metrics would traditionally say the business is worth from a financial perspective.
Right. And I know you said there's so much more that we could cover on this topic, but we're
We
running
get
out of
rolling here,
time.
we'll never stop.
Yeah, so let's say, I'm sure you have something you'd like to share with the listeners that would maybe help them start planning for their future and selling. So what might that be?
Well, one of the things I would really suggest, and yeah, I have a podcast and I enjoy doing the podcast, but if you're someone that is looking to learn from the mistakes and also those people that have executed at a very high level and how they were able to do this and why they were able to do it, and avoid the pitfalls by learning from others, you really should listen to the podcast and subscribe to it. And you can find it, wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever. Just search Business Exit Stories podcast and you'll find it there and subscribe, because every week there are 4 transactional stories shared by the people that make it happen. And they bring 2 transactions that didn't go very well, had their problems, maybe closed, maybe did not, and why. That's the big deal here. Why didn't it happen? And what can you do to avoid what happened to them? And as well, 2 transactions went well. They were over the fence home runs. And why? How did that happen? What do the owners do? And so these takeaways, and you listen to the podcast for a period of weeks, there's a lot of stories, hundreds of stories there, and you listen to these, then you start to get this frame of mind and attitude of things that intuitively feel good to you and what you can start doing. And you just almost organically start thinking differently. And I also have, for those that are kind of closer to the exit window, have a downloadable about how to double the amount of money you can get for your business, put in your pocket when you sell. And it's sort of an overview of things that we've kind of talked about here, that you can just go to Business Exit Stories /report number 2, that's report 2, and download that report. It would be an interesting read for you. It'll get you thinking anyway.
Perfect. And any other way that you want to share for anyone to reach out to you besides just getting that podcast or a download?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Marvin L Storm. That's my LinkedIn handle. And the best way, I think, that where you get the most value is just to listen to the podcast for a while. And then if you need to chat beyond that, you can reach out to me through LinkedIn or my email, which is mstorm@businessexitstories.com. M for Marvin and Storm for Storm.
Perfect.
So you can reach out to me. That's my email address. And I get a lot of inbound inquiries about this or that, and I'm glad to address those.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Marvin, for being a guest on my show and sharing your stories and expertise on this topic. I'm sure the listeners found it very helpful.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. We get to talking here, and I get very excitable about this topic. So.
No, it's good. It's always nice to have some stories that back up with the tips that you're sharing too. So I'm sure it will be helpful for those who listened. And I do hope that if you did listen in, you found some help for your plan for either now or the future on your business exit strategy. If you have additional questions or comments, be sure to reach out to Marvin at the links that he shared and listen to his podcast too. Or you can also send us a message at media@abandp.com. And would you please share our show information with those you know? I'd greatly appreciate your support. I hope you can join us for next week's topic, self-love and confidence in business. And please remember, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And my website is abandp.com. And remember, you could find the podcast posted on multiple favorite podcast platforms, including Google, TuneIn, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. Until next time, have a great week.
Thank you for listening to Biz Help for You. Please join your host, Candy Messer, again next Tuesday. Have a terrific week.